Today we're going to talk about the tail of the advanced persistent threat, or the tail of the APT. Now, of course, when we hear about these particular terms like APTs and DDoSes and specific numbers allocated to the end of the APT terminology, it kind of conjures up a vision of threats that are so sophisticated and so capable that the ability to be able to detect or the ability to be able to respond to those may seem a little concerning. But what is the tail of the APT? In other words, what actually is occurring? Today, what we're going to do is we're actually going to do a walkthrough of some attacks that we've witnessed that have come from APT groups. But more importantly, we're going to answer the question, which is, well, what can I do about it? I mean, if the threat actor is so capable, the threat actor is so innovative, how do we actually stop, or how do we actually detect malicious activity? And really, what is the impact of these types of threats, which I think is utterly crucial as well. And what we'll do is let's get started with one. And of course, this was a piece of research that was done by my team in which we identified an APT group that was targeting the Winter Olympics in Pyeongchang. Now, to try to understand the impact of these types of threats, it's important to understand what the malware was actually doing. And in this particular instance, what had happened was the threat actors actually did what we suspect to be open source intelligence in order to identify individuals that were involved in some way, shape, or form with the infrastructure associated with the Winter Olympic Games. By identifying them, they were able to craft and develop content that they suspected would likely result in the targets of these emails to actually interact with them. And of course, that in itself resulted in compromise of their systems and the more than likely the potential ability to be able to gather intelligence for the purposes of the nation state. And that's what we're talking about. When we talk about cyber threats, when we talk about attacks or espionage or intelligence and all of these various different terminologies, fundamentally, it is about identifying and gathering intelligence that is for the purposes of that particular state, whether it's intelligence or whether it's something else. But ultimately, this is the net result of these types of attacks. And of course, with the Winter Olympics, what we saw was a level of capability that I think was quite advanced. I mean, in the first instance, when we witnessed this at the back end of the year, we witnessed that they were actually having malicious documents. So in other words, what they were doing was they were purporting to come from the counterterrorism unit and asking people to open up emails related to the security of the games. And of course, when people opened those documents, it launched a PowerShell script, which then allowed the download of an image file from a remote location. But what was interesting, specifically with regards to this, is during the actual campaign, I think we could have divided it up into two phases, and they were actually leveraging and utilizing a technique called steganography. And so almost in real time, we saw the use of, or really the development of more nefarious techniques to obfuscate the true objective of what they were trying to do. In this particular instance, using Stego allowed the adversary the ability to be able to hide even better. And that's what we're dealing with. When we talk about capable threat actors, we're dealing with threat actors that do innovate. We're dealing with threat actors that have the ability to develop new code, the ability to be able to identify targets and make the lures as convincing as they possibly can. Ultimately, they're hiding in plain sight. The ability to be able to carry out their attacks, but do so in a manner that is not so easy to identify. And for me, this is one of the key differences that we see, or the key differences that we see is, over the past year, we've had a deluge of volume-related attacks associated with, the COVID-related scams. And of course, during that time, There was a small number of campaigns that were being carried out by APT groups, but of course the volume was considerably lower. Now, this particular threat actor had been actually in operation for a number of years, but what was interesting is if we start to map and analyze some of the tools that they use and some of the techniques and the malware that they use, a lot of the malware, when we do code analysis, actually has its roots in older malware going back considerably longer. So for example, in Operation Troy, we witnessed malware that had overlap with code that we saw as far back as 2009. And in part, a lot of this is enabled by the fact that actually some APT groups, not all, are really highly organized in terms of how they carry out their attacks. There are specific units designed for the purposes of the threat that they want to carry out. Now, it's not just this particular threat actor that we should be concerned about. In fact, I kind of touched upon this earlier, but when we start to consider the threat actors that are there, and certainly some of the APT groups that are there, and the level of innovation that we witness, the reality is that there are many threat actor groups that have a really high degree of capability. I think in October the year before, we actually witnessed the use of dynamic DDE techniques that were leveraged. DDE was a technique that was detailed by the cybersecurity community. I believe it was in like September. And really, it was only a month later that we began to witness the use of this technique being used in the wild, in this instance, targeting military personnel of US origin based in Europe. And of course, for me, this is one of the things that sets capable threat actors such as organized crime groups as well as APT groups to, I guess, some of the run-of-the-mill actors that we witness, is in this instance, what they did was they read the research, they analyzed how it can be used for malicious purposes, and they deployed that almost within a month. Whereas if you compare it to, say, some of the more less capable threat actors, I mean, typically we're not seeing the rate of innovation that we've witnessed before. And of course, a lot of this kind of correlates with regards to the Winter Olympics attack, in which the use of Stego was used. And, I kind of wanted to ask the question of you, which is, were you aware of the DDE techniques that were published? And if you were aware of the DDE techniques that were published, did you apply the patches that have been made available? I mean, whether you read it or not is almost, it's imperative, but the reality is that the bad guys are actively tracking and monitoring these new threats, these new vulnerabilities, and they're leveraging and utilizing those for their own malicious purposes. And of course, this was the threat that was carried out by the Fancy Bear group. In this instance, they were leveraging and utilizing the New York City terror attack, targeting military personnel. And once, obviously, the document was opened, then it would use DDE techniques in order to be able to invoke a PowerShell to download malware. And so we're dealing with threat actors that, and invariably people will say, well, hey, look, a phishing attack is a phishing attack. But whilst the use of email as an entry vector may not be necessarily unique, we have to acknowledge and recognize the fact that the techniques that are being leveraged and utilized are innovative. And of course, this is going back a few years. If we look just most recently to North Star, Operation North Star, which we published late last year. And when we gained access to the C2, again, we saw in this particular example, template injection attacks. So we're dealing with threat actors that are innovative. We're dealing with threat actors that are developing new techniques, and we're identifying the fact that they're very laser focused in terms of targeting individuals that they want to go after. In North Star, for example, what was remarkable was they actually created LinkedIn accounts of potential recruiters, and those potential recruiters engaged with the targets that they wanted to go after. Now, in many ways, one might argue, well, look, this level of innovation and capability is really only reserved to a small number of APT groups. And whilst there's a modicum of truth in that, it doesn't necessarily reduce the risk to organizations. And, you know, a great example was published by Citizen Lab going back a number of years. And so, of course, since that date, a lot has moved on. But one thing that remains is the fact that there are many, many nation states out there actively investing in offensive cyber operations for, you know, whatever their ultimate purpose is. I mean, in this case, for Finn Fisher and Hacking Team, it was with regards to gathering and garnering intelligence. And so whenever we see or read about APT groups, we have to recognize that there is, whilst you may have some of the players that are really capable, there are many threat actors out there that have certainly a much higher degree of capability, and actually they're actively acquiring tools for their own malicious purposes. And that's the reality. You know, when we talk about APT groups, we have to recognize that there's an increase in nation states contacting or contracting private companies to achieve their hacking operations. And this, of course, was from cyber reason, but we really truly are dealing with an economy or a cybercrime as a service. And that cybercrime as a service model doesn't just apply to, for example, ransomware operators that I know has been in the press recently, but actually applies to many different threat actors, including those at the very top of the chain. So what are we doing and how are we responding as an industry? Well, I'd argue not very well. I mean, one such example, which you'll hear me talk a lot about if you ever kind of review some of my publications in the past, which is, you know, you take Whois as an example. Now, Whois really for me is the first stop that we would use in investigating any sort of malicious campaign. You know, if we identify a domain or we identify a C2 that's used as part of an attack or you know, a mail sending domain, the first thing we'll obviously do is check the Whois records. Does that reveal any information? You know, when was it registered? Who was it registered by? Where was it? You know, all of those questions. And of course, with the advent of GDPR, which by the way is a positive thing, Whois actually went dark. And of course, it's not just me that impacts, not just the cybersecurity private sector community, but also law enforcement. And of course, this was taken from the 2018 report from Europol's Internet Organized Crime Threat Assessment Report. And they talk about how MLATs, mutual legal assistance treaties, have to be raised in order to be able to gather this information. And so all of a sudden, one of the very first steps that we would do, we've now introduced a massive delay in our ability to be able to identify details with regards to that domain. So what can you be doing? I mean, it sounds simple. It really does sound simple. But one of the first things you can be doing is starting to keep yourself up to speed with the latest content, information, threats, and campaigns. I mean, whenever we as an industry publish details of vulnerabilities, whenever Microsoft release details of patches, that's not to arm the adversary, that's done to enable you to have the information you need to protect yourself. And I realize and recognize that it is quite daunting, just the volume of content and noise out there. But the reality is the bad guys are reading this content. The bad guys are developing tools in order to be able to exploit these vulnerabilities. And unless you're one step ahead of them, patching your systems, reading about it, understanding about campaigns, analyzing the pervasiveness of certain campaigns, quite frankly, you're behind the curve. So the first thing that I think is, and the most important thing you should be doing, is keeping yourself up to speed with the latest content, the latest information, the latest vulnerabilities, the latest campaigns. This is critical. And I realize and appreciate the fact that there is a lot of noise out there. There's a lot of threats out there, or sorry, a lot of other people publishing content. You've got to basically tailor your content feeds appropriately. So, rather than the hundreds and hundreds of, various different threat feeds you can sign up to, pick the ones that work for you and actively read them. And what you might want to be able to do is define those into categories, which is actionable intelligence that is applicable to you. So, for example, if there's a campaign that's targeting your sector, then maybe read that first. That's the must do this morning. If there's stuff that's not hitting your threat vector, but potentially you are vulnerable to, then maybe you want to put that as a secondary. So like start to tailor your threat feed accordingly, and that to me is crucial. And by the way, the ATR, my ATR team, Advanced Threat Research team, routinely and actively publish content that we think will be helpful. And of course, leverage and utilize third-party platforms. I mean, the last week or two, we've had a lot of discussion with regards to, I think specifically dark side ransomware. We've had a lot of discussion with regards to Conti ransomware. I mean, there are platforms out there that, in the event that something occurs, will be able to give you, for example, remediation tools like decryption tools. And No More Ransom to me is one of those portals. And so, if nothing else that you take from this talk, I would want to stress that, be proactive in terms of analyzing content and feeds. More importantly, take actions based upon your learnings, and fundamentally have the resource and repositories of tools and platforms that will assist and support you in the event that you are compromised. And so things like No More Ransom should absolutely be within your favorites, without a doubt. I mean, not only will it, more importantly, not only will it give you proactive information on how to best protect yourself, equally it will give you tools that will allow you to decrypt where applicable. But also there's a reporting mechanism that allow you to report specific incidents to law enforcement. I cannot stress enough, we are seeing a level of capability from threat actors improve routinely. And of course, the bad guys themselves feel as though that there's no risk to them. We deal in an environment whereby individuals can carry out attacks from halfway across the world without ever setting foot in the territory that they cause damage to. And they're being very, very aggressive. I mean, this was the C2 domains for GandCrab, and GandCrab actively put C2 domains that called out the industry, no more ransom.bit or bleepingcomputer.bit. So they've got no qualms or concerns with regards to challenging us. And, more importantly, failure to address some of these fundamental issues will result in a economic or a potential life and death impact to society. And of course, this was WannaCry, but we've seen the impact that it's had in the last week with regards to ransomware attacks against healthcare, with regards to attacks against oil and gas. And so it is absolutely imperative that some of these lessons are learned. I would ask, and really to kind of summarize where we're at, as I mentioned, threat actors are getting better. They are reading the content. They are actively leveraging and utilizing the vulnerabilities that are identified for their own purpose and for their own objectives. If you're not at the very least keeping up with them, let alone staying one step ahead of them, then the issues that we've witnessed and we've seen over the last 2 weeks, and the issues that we witnessed over the last number of years, sadly will only continue. So look, my my Twitter feed is there, so feel free to connect. And every week or every day, I'm always publishing new content related to threat feeds. But look at others, so McAfee Labs, Christian Beek. There are other really good sources that you can use to get this content. And please start to bookmark some of the portals that you'll need in the event that things didn't go wrong. with that, I'd like to thank you all for your time, and please stay safe. Thank you.